Welcome to the new show. I'm your host, Random Rob. Tonight I'm talking about the year 1981. Why was 1981 important? 1981 was a significant year for American horror movies. Now, most of the box office for horror that year was filled with more of the traditional kind of horror exploitation films people had seen in the previous decade. The difference was that there were three high-profile werewolf films that came out that year. Or if you really want to be technical, there were two and a half. The Howling, American Werewolf in London, and Wolfen. Now, why three werewolf movies in 1 year? I think that probably had to do with studio gossip. People finding out that one company was working on a werewolf film that looked to be a little more high-tech, a little more serious than had been done before. Now, werewolf films had their roots going back to the 1930s and 40s, films starring Lon Chaney, but more often than not, they were often creaky kind of genre films, basically just slasher films with somebody wearing a werewolf mask and some makeup and some claws. Nobody at the time had really thought about doing a serious werewolf movie with state-of-the-art special effects. To try to do a modern take on a genre that was 40 years old at that point, but had never really had anything that was considered standout in terms of technical achievement, since the makeup effects that Lon Chaney did with compositing film and lighting to make the transformation happen. So let's talk about The Howling. This was Joe Dante's first big feature film. It was based on a book by Terence Winkless, who had written a screenplay treatment for Dante, but Dante didn't like it, so he got John Sayles to adapt it and change it and make something better out of it. And if you're not familiar with John Sayles, I would advise you to look up all the movies he's written, because his writing is always terrific. Regardless of budget and who's in the film. I think the year before, the movie Alligator had been released by Roger Corman studio, a horror exploitation film about a giant alligator with a great performance by Robert Forster, who passed away recently. Really fun movie. If you ever wanted to see a giant mutated alligator show up and trash a wedding, check out Alligator. John Sayles wrote a really funny script for The Howling. And of the three films, The Howling is really the most experimental film. It has a wonderful sort of jumble of fun ideas in it. It pokes fun at pop psychology. It pokes fun at sensationalistic TV journalism. It features a really, really memorable character part by Robert Picardo as the serial killer Billy. He doesn't just transform into a werewolf in this film. He really becomes this other character. One of the great performances of his career. Can't state that strongly enough. The Howling featured prosthetic makeup and animated makeups by makeup special effects wizard Rob Bottin, who would go on to do his groundbreaking work on John Carpenter's The Thing. And Bottin actually took over for makeup man Rick Baker. And Baker had studied under Dick Smith, who was famous old school Hollywood prosthetic makeup designer who had done the incredible makeup effects in The Exorcist. And something I always like to point out when talking about The Exorcist is, and I mention this because of the box office debacle of the recent adaptation of the movie Cats, which I believe creeped the audiences out a little bit with some of the CGI prosthetic makeups they did for that film. I mean, far be it from me to tell Hollywood, how to do its job, but when you consider the fact that most computer-generated effects look dated after a couple of years, watch The Exorcist. Those makeups still look good. Still look convincing and scary, and that film is over 40 years old. Practical effects. Anyway, so Baker couldn't stay on The Howling. He got Rob Bottin to take it over for him. Bottin did some very good transformation effects for this film. In the case of both The Howling and American Werewolf, there was a lot of hype surrounding the makeup effects in both these movies. And this is going to get into why I want to talk about this, why this was an important year for horror. In the early 80s, fabricating and making rubber appliances became a lot cheaper to do, a lot easier to do, mostly due to the fact that much thinner pieces could be fabricated. There were different processes and techniques they could do with them because of that, because they were more lightweight. For example, they could blow air through them, compressed air, and get like rippling effects. The transformation effects in the Howling looked good. For the time, they looked very good. They look a little dated now. If there's one real problem with the Howling, it's that too much attention is put on the transformation sequence. It goes on so long when you're watching it, you may wonder why Dee Wallace just doesn't leave the room. Maybe she's backed up into a corner or something. When comparing the two films, one thing that's noticeable is that Rick Baker's transformation sequence in American Werewolf is the better of the two. It was also done fully lit, brightly lit scene, unlike the Howling where the effects are kind of kept in the dark so you can just sort of make them out. American Werewolf was definitely the better film, technically the better film in terms of the transformation effects. And it's a much more frightening picture. I would say at the time, the first hour of American Werewolf in London, the build-up, that is some really tense shit. And I had actually gone to see it with my friend Michael, who knew the ticket seller at this particular theater. We were both 13. And if you're familiar with American Werewolf in London, there is a dream sequence where the main character's family is massacred by these Nazi ghoul creatures who come into the house and cut everyone's throat. I completely lost my shit, ran out of the theater. It would be many years later before I realized that that was one of the first panic attacks I ever remember having. And in hindsight, I wish I had stuck around, because the second half of American Werewolf in London isn't actually that scary. The build-up is way more tense than the rest of the film. And I would also point out, this is another funny difference between The Howling and American Werewolf, is that although American Werewolf has the better transformation scene, The Howling has the better werewolf, the better finished werewolf. And the finished werewolf in the Howling, from what I've read, was actually kind of like a last-minute effect, where they had wanted to add a scene in the doctor's office or extend the scene in the doctor's office. And Bottin made a partial, torso, arms and head puppet of a full-sized werewolf. And it is a damn effective puppet for this very short scene that it's in the film. And if you look at it and then look at the finished werewolf puppet they made for American Werewolf, The Howling's is definitely the better one. It has a much more long, lanky, kind of elongated look to it. It just looks right. And it looks scary. So what about Wolfen? Wolfen was directed by Michael Wadley, starred Albert Finney. Wolfen is basically a New York detective story, investigating a series of murders linked to animal attacks. And he comes to find out as the film progresses that there are people possessed by wolf spirits, and there's this whole Native American subplot in it, which was an unusual take for that kind of story. They also used real wolves. They came up with a film compositing hybrid effect that I believe they called Alienvision. And what Alienvision was a technique they used for the wolf's eye point of view scenes in the film. And they were simultaneously shooting the same shots with a regular camera and a thermographic camera. And then they composited the images together. So it almost has this weird negative, but not negative image with these weird false colors. Something different. Probably the weakest film of the three, although it has really good performances in it. And a unique modern take on an older horror genre. If you were going to ask me which of the three is my favorite, I would definitely say The Howling, because of the three, it's the one I enjoy rewatching the most, because I love the humor in it. It's very funny and very campy. It also switches gears between humor and horror really well. Both The Howling and American Werewolf were considered horror comedies, although I think the comic tone of The Howling works with the material better. Although my favorite thing in American Werewolf in London is Griffin Dunn's performance as the progressively decaying spirit of the main character's dead friend. But as to my main point, why was this such an important year for horror? Specifically because The Howling and American Werewolf were, for their time, high-end horror films. They got critical notice, they were well reviewed. American Werewolf especially did very well at the box office, and was probably more than any other horror film that came out that year in the US, except The Evil Dead by Sam Raimi, really showed the public and Hollywood that rubber makeup effects had hit the next generation. And as a result, there were so many films that came out after that with iconic creature effects. And all these makeup artists working in rubber trying to outdo one another. Just a really fertile and creative time for horror films that might not have happened for another 10 years if Dante and Landis hadn't pushed the genre forward when they did. 1981, important year for horror, important year for werewolves. And in the future, I'm going to be talking a little more about werewolves and talk a bit about kickstarting my indie werewolf film, Billy. Well, thanks for dropping by. I wanted to say, if you're watching this and you are following me on Twitter, thank you. Really appreciate all the follows I've been getting lately and supportive comments. If you like the new show, want to ask me a question, totally hit me up on Twitter or Facebook. And if you like this video and my other content, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. And I'll see you around this time next Tuesday on the new show. This is Random Rob. Take care.